It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I had planned my wedding for months, obsessed over every detail, and finally reached the moment I had dreamed of since I was a child. But life, as I've learned, doesn't always follow our scripts, and that day, fate chose to rewrite mine with ink made of betrayal and humiliation. My fiancé David was everything I thought I wanted: charming, smart, and well-connected. We had met at work, at the large corporate firm where I'd spent the last 6 years climbing the ladder. He was the son of the CEO, the golden boy who everyone assumed would eventually take over. Our relationship had been quiet at first, mostly because I didn't want anyone to think I was trying to sleep my way to the top. I worked hard, very hard. I came early, left late, volunteered for the projects no one wanted. I earned every promotion and raised my own credibility without riding on anyone's coattails, even David's. When he proposed, it was romanticon, a weekend getaway in Napa. I was in love and didn't question anything. But on our wedding day, just minutes before I was about to walk down the aisle, I received a message from one of my bridesmaids. It had a video attached. Shaky phone footage, clearly taken secretly. The footage showed David, my fiancé, flirting and making out with one of our interns at the office, just 2 nights before the wedding. I watched in horror, my veil in my lap, my hands trembling. The world around me faded as betrayal sank deep into my chest. But the worst part wasn't even the cheating, it was the smirk on his face. He had no guilt, no shame. As I sat there trying to process what I'd seen, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was from David. "Let's call it off. I don't think you're CEO wife material," it read. No apology, no explanation, just arrogance. In that moment, something inside me shattered and something else ignited. I didn't cry, not immediately. I stood up, wiped off the makeup smudged by silent shock, and stepped out of the dressing room. The guests were still arriving, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I asked one of my friends to quietly escort my family out. "Tell them the wedding is off. No questions." The hall we'd rented had cost thousands. The food was catered, the flowers flown in from another state. And yet, none of it mattered. David had not only embarrassed me personally, he had humiliated me professionally. My reputation at the office would now be inextricably tied to the gossip of a wedding that never happened, to the boss's son who discarded his fiancée like a used tissue. But what David didn't know was that I had spent the past year documenting his behavior, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity. There had been rumors, whispers among the female staff, about how he leveraged his position for favors. HR had brushed it off, especially with him being the CEO's son. But I had emails, screenshots, and now, thanks to the bridesmaid, a video. I went home, took a long shower, and let the anger boil into clarity. This wasn't just was a corporate war now. And I had no intention of losing. The next morning, while David posted selfies from the beach with that same intern, pretending like the wedding never existed, I walked into the office, calm, confident. Everyone expected me to resign. I expected whispers and stares, and I got them. But I also had something they didn't: leverage. I walked straight to the legal department and handed over a sealed file. "Confidential," I said, "for the board only." The file contained everything: months of documentation, witness statements from interns too afraid to speak openly, proof of misuse of company resources, and of course, the infamous video. I didn't attach my name to it directly. I simply submitted it as a concerned employee, requesting an internal investigation. I knew the wheels would turn. Slowly, corporate culture always protected its own butt. I also knew the board didn't take sexual misconduct lightly, especially when backed by legal evidence. I returned to my desk. Business as usual, ignoring the looks. David strolled in like a king, acting as though nothing had happened, giving me a smug glance that would have cut through my soul if I hadn't already cut him off in my mind. He even had the audacity to announce a staff happy hour to celebrate his upcoming promotion. Apparently, his father had hinted he'd soon be VP of Strategic Operations. I said nothing, but inside, I was counting down the days. Then came the meeting, an unscheduled emergency board meeting that was called without the usual PR spin. David was called in, then his father. The entire floor went silent. No one knew what was going on. For 2 hours, they were locked behind closed doors. When they emerged, David's face was pale. His father's eyes didn't meet anyone's. By 3 p.m., an official email went out. David Richards has resigned from the company, effective immediately. No explanation, no farewell speech, just gone. People were shocked, confused, curious, but I knew. Karma had called and it rang from the CEO's own boardroom. Things didn't end there. The resignation was only the start. HR launched a formal investigation, this time with external auditors involved. Every person who had ever worked under David was interviewed. I sat through mine with poise, answering questions I had waited years to be asked. For the first time, the silence was breaking. What came out shocked even the board. David had been manipulating budgets, falsifying reports to make his projects look more successful, and in some cases, directly siphoning off company funds to pay for personal trips. His behavior wasn't just toxic, it was criminal. A lawsuit followed, and so did a subpoena. He tried to reach out to me once through a mutual friend, begging me to drop it. I laughed. Drop it? After he humiliated me in front of hundreds of guests, after he used his father's name as a shield to harass women in the office, not a chance. The CEO, perhaps to protect his own legacy, announced he'd be retiring early, citing health reasons. A new interim CEO was appointed, a woman who had worked with me on several major projects. She called me into her office within a week and said, "I've been watching how you handled this. We need leaders who won't flinch when it matters. I'm promoting you to Director of Strategic Development." Just like that, everything David thought he stole from me I earned without his name. My career took off, not because of pity, but because I had turned betrayal into battle. I kept my head down, delivered results, and slowly became the trusted voice in high-level meetings. While most would have been satisfied with a promotion and justice served, I wasn't done. There was still a reputation to rebuild, not just mine, but of every woman who had ever been silenced by corporate power games. I began mentoring interns, quietly helping them navigate the same corridors where I was once cornered by whispers inside. I launched an internal initiative focused on ethical leadership and employee safety, backed by HR and legal, but unofficially powered by my story. I never publicly named David in the company newsletter, nor did I talk about what happened at my wedding, but people knew. They knew because his absence echoed louder than his presence ever did. I was invited to speak on panels, consulted on restructuring teams, and eventually became part of a hiring committee for senior roles. I'd gone from the woman who'd been abandoned at the altar to the woman who could now rewrite policies. Outside of work, I found peace in the silence he left behind. My friends, especially those who had stood by me, remained close. We laughed again. I traveled. I rediscovered parts of myself that had withered while trying to be someone's perfect fiancé, and one day, in the middle of a quiet Sunday brunch with a friend, I got a message request. It was from David. "I messed up. I lost everything. I miss you." I stared at the message for a full minute before deleting it without replying. Closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes, it comes from knowing you no longer need one. By the end of that year, our company had changed drastically. Transparency became a cornerstone. The board implemented zero-tolerance harassment policies, launched anonymous reporting tools, and restructured power dynamics between executives and junior staff. I wasn't the face of the change, but I was the backbone. The new CEO, a tough but fair leader, began pulling me into larger strategic decisions. I found myself on video calls with international teams, presenting solutions to challenges I never thought I'd be asked to fix. One day, during an investor meeting, someone jokingly said, "You've got CEO energy." Everyone laughed, but I didn't. Not because I was offended, but because for the first time, it didn't feel like a joke. Meanwhile, David's name popped up in the news again, this time, tied to another lawsuit from a different company. He had tried to start over elsewhere but couldn't escape the consequences of his pattern. His fall from grace was no longer my burden, it was just another chapter in his own story. Mine, however, was just beginning. The more I achieved, the more I realized I didn't need revenge to feel fulfilled. Success was revenge enough. I wasn't driven by anger anymore, was driven by vision. And every day, that vision grew clearer. Empower, elevate, and never let anyone decide my worth for me again. About 18 months after the wedding, our company held its annual retreat, a luxurious event, usually reserved for top performers and executives. I was invited not just as a participant but as a keynote speaker. My topic was Rising After Ruin. I didn't tell my personal story, but I wove themes of resilience, integrity, and courage into every sentence. When I finished, The room stood in applause. A colleague approached me afterward and said, "I don't know what happened in your past, but I can see it made you bulletproof." I smiled. I'd never been bulletproof, just determined. Later that evening, while networking over drinks, I met someone, Ethan. He was part of a partner firm we'd collaborated with on a sustainability project. He was kind, quiet, and didn't once mention his job title during our first conversation. We talked for hours, not about business or broken weddings, but about books, hiking trails, and the perfect pancake recipe. It wasn't love at first sight, it was peace at first sentence. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just healing, I was whole. And I was finally allowing myself to open up to someone without fear of being shattered. My journey continued, not in a straight line, but in upward spirals. I was offered a position on a board of a nonprofit focused on workplace equality. I accepted. I was later approached by a business magazine for an anonymous feature titled, "The Woman Who Took Down a Dynasty and Built Her Own." I laughed when I read the headline, "Draft, dramatic, yes, but also a little true." I reviewed the article carefully, asking the editors to focus more on policy reform and less on corporate gossip. They agreed. When it was published, the piece gained traction. My LinkedIn inbox flooded with messages from women across industries, thanking me for being a silent voice for them. Some shared their own stories, some asked for advice, some just said, "Thank you for proving it's possible." I made time to respond to every single one, because I remembered what it felt like to be unheard. Meanwhile, my relationship with Ethan evolved quietly, gracefully. He respected my silence about the past and never tried to dissect the scars. He just held my hand through them, and that, I learned, was more powerful than any apology David could have ever offered. 2 years after the canceled wedding, our company announced a massive leadership restructuring. The interim CEO was stepping into a global role, and the board was seeking candidates for the top position domestically. I was one of 3 finalists. The day they called me in for the final round, I didn't wear anything flashy, just a navy suit and the same pair of heels I had worn to what was supposed to be my wedding. Not for sentiment, but as a silent reminder, full circle doesn't require fanfare. I presented my strategic vision, laid out a 5-year plan, and answered every question with the clarity that could only come from living through storms and still choosing to build. When I walked out of the room, I didn't know if I'd be chosen. I just knew I had shown them the truth of who I was. 3 days later, I got the call. "We'd like you to be our new CEO." I stood in the middle of my kitchen, barefoot and holding a mug of tea, when those words hit me. And for the first time in 2 years, I cried. Not because I was broken, but because I had rebuilt everything that had once crumbled. And I had done it on my own terms. At my formal introduction as CEO, I stood behind the podium and looked out at a sea of familiar faces, some who had doubted me, some who had supported me, and some who had simply watched. I didn't use my speech to talk about victories or titles. Instead, I said, "Sometimes, the worst day of your life is the first page of your best chapter." The room went silent, not out of confusion, but because every single person there knew what I meant. David's name wasn't mentioned. He didn't need to be. The legacy I had created spoke louder than any scandal ever could. After the event, I went home, took off my heels, and curled up on the couch next to Ethan. We didn't toast with champagne. We just sat there, watching the sunset through the windows of a life I had fought to protect, to build, to earn. And, somewhere deep inside, I knew karma doesn't always arrive in fire and fury. Sometimes, it walks in wearing a navy suit, holding a vision, and sits at the head of the table. And when it does, you don't have to scream, "I won." The world already knows.